I'm Dr. Jean Sherman, founder and director of SCCI, the Sherman Centre for Culture and Ideas. In this episode of the SCCI Cinéphile documentary series, we return home to Sydney, where we meet with architects Phillip Rossington, Principal, and Ninotschka Titchkosky, Co-CEO of BVN. Interestingly, BVN was originally founded almost a century ago, in 1926 to be precise. And unsurprisingly from my perspective, the practice has won more Sir John Sulman medals than any other Australian architectural firm. In addition to Atelier in Sydney and Brisbane, BVN now has studios in New York and London. My close working relationship with BVN started more than a decade ago with James Gross and Phillip Rossington. BVN generously and with minimum preliminary discussion readily agreed to support the Sherman Contemporary Art Foundation, SCAF, as principal partner of Fugitive Structures, the first pavilion series of its kind in Australia, the aim of which was to showcase the innovative potential of temporary small-scale structures. Since these first collaborations, in which Bill Dowser and Abby Galvin participated, BVN has continued to support SCCI's vision for a vibrant, authentic and courageous approach to the built environment. SCCI's Swan Song project is to be launched in October 2022 and will be delivered in tandem with the Australian Government UK-Australia Season of Culture. For this project, BVN returns as SCCI's principal partner, bringing more than a decade's worth of collaborative endeavours to a crowning point. SCCI is delighted to return to Sydney for this final episode, featuring world-leading practitioners in architecture, design and fashion. Ninotschka and Phillip are now joined by SCCI Sydney correspondent and University of Sydney Professor of Practice, Kate Goodwin.
BVN, the three very simple letters by which the practice is known by, in some ways belies the rich and complex history that's seen the amalgamation of many practices over almost 100 years. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the history of the practice and how that's come to form and shape who you are now.
Yeah, well, BVN does have a really long history actually, and it started in 1926 with Arthur Bligh. From then to now, it's had probably about 14 transformations in its history. One of the really kind of interesting things about BVN is it's just been sort of a morphing ecosystem its whole life. And the great thing about that for us is it means that we can kind of continuously, we're very comfortable with change because it's kind of, it's what we are. I think we've always kind of embedded it in BVN's own sort of DNA.
And I think the last one was with Donovan Hill in Brisbane, and that brought to us a whole different way of even talking about our architecture and how we describe it in drawings and how we approach.
And so your practice of 300 people, I think, something like that, 200 here in Sydney, 100 up in Brisbane, like 3 in New York and a couple over in London. So it's quite a big family you've got there. How do you structure yourself and organise?
Well, one of the reasons I even came to BVN was that the ownership's equal. So we're all interested in how the practice is going all around the world. We're not just sitting in our little bubble where we are. The meeting of principals is actually usually got filled of laughter, and it's a thing you look forward to going through. So obviously there's the owners, there's a board, there's what we call a studio planning group, which is really the engine, if you like, it's a better word, that actually enacts everything, and that's made up of a broader spectrum of people in the company. There's just a system of meetings that happen for that enact things through from the board and the principals through the studio planning group.
There's 16 principals, is that right? And
At
then
the moment,
at the moment, always evolving.
And that's constantly evolving.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is. There's 16 at the moment, and as you said, it's always evolving for us, and we keep looking to, what we need next as a business and what we need next as a practice. I want to talk about this office here. It's quite a distinct experience, Messy?
No.
Chaos?
I know there's a wonder to it, but also I guess that the arrival, you're in the heart of the city of Sydney. It's in quite a, corporate environment downstairs. You know, you've got the Hilton, you've got the slick security, the intelligent lifts, which are more intelligent than we are sometimes of coming in. And suddenly you come into this space which feels a real contrast to that. You know, it's a sort of, you see the workshop straight ahead of you, you see the making, you see these pizzas. And I was wondering how conscious that was, one, about the choice of being in the city here, like why you're in this location, and then what this space means for you and how that's cultivating and perhaps even progressing your own kind of office culture here.
I mean, I think it's fairly deliberate, but I suppose it also is pretty authentic to who we are as well. I mean, the way that we think of our studio is it's actually an opportunity for us to experiment with things that sometimes, you know, might be a step too far for our clients to perhaps see at this point in time, but by experimenting in our own space, it gives them the confidence to see that, you know, things are possible. We absolutely kind of use ourselves as guinea pigs and sort of try and practice what we're trying to instill in terms of thinking and mindsets and possibilities into clients. But I think in being in the city, a practice of our scale and size, it's absolutely fundamental that we feel sort of engaged in the fabric of the built environment, and we kind of being quite central allows us to, I don't know, so it gives us access not only to the city but to most of our client base. It's also a great place for all our people to get to, so it doesn't disenfranchise people coming from different parts of Sydney. It's great for anyone travelling because they can stay and work here with us. They don't have to leave the building for days at a time. But then the other part is that we want, you know, anyone coming in, whether it's our people or whether it's external people, to walk in the studio and sort of feel the energy of, you know, why come and work with us at BVN. We're kind of interested in making, we're interested in digital fabrication, we're interested in how we occupy space, and we want everyone to feel sort of immersed in that experience, I think. And
from the moment you walk in the door, it is really quite pleasant when people come out of the lift and walk into the Sydney studio and they go, oh. And in the Brisbane studio, they actually walk into, it's similar aesthetic in the way, experimental, and you actually walk into the architectural library, so people step into that and go, oh, have I come into a private sort of library? It's about just letting people know straight away that you're not coming into a place where we've got an idea that you can beautifully formed joinery and totally sort of refined, as I said, but you're coming into a place where people experiment, and you can see that clients or people, when they come in, they actually wander away from reception. They go over to the 3D printing, they'll go and look at some of the model objects and they'll go, what is this? So it's a nice conversation, it makes people interested. People like to come here. Our clients often say, look, I'm in the city for a while, can I stay in the studio for 2 or 3 hours after our meeting? And so it's a place people want to be. And in fact, even the people we all work here, times when there's been to go out to have a function after a Christmas party, or people say, can we just go to the studio? Fine.
We want to be sort of a practice that's kind of optimistic, and it's also open and kind of enables dialogue and such things to happen. And so you can't walk into a absolutely pristine environment and have that ethos. It just doesn't translate. So I guess, you know, our space is a reflection of all of those things that we believe in.
One of the more exciting things that happened was the systems reef, which we were constructing here. There were robots in here creating these
live fabricating.
Live fabricating. For everybody that wasn't involved in that project, obviously they all of a sudden knew about it, and they knew what problems were happening with the robots, what the next step to try and fix that was. So all of a sudden 200 people here had an experience of robotic construction, and so that's the sort of thing that we're aiming for.
And as you say, I think seeing the robotics in action and what it can do is also, I mean, it's intriguing, isn't it, and fascinating, and engaging in the kind of possibilities, and you sort of see it live in a workshop here.
Yeah, rather than something you just watch a video on, or somebody's doing it over there. It was happening here.
We very much kind of have a view that it's not like technology taking over the world in a dystopian vision of it, but it should actually be an optimistic view about how we harness new technologies to actually improve what we're doing. And to be honest, there's heaps of scope for that in the work that we do, like trying to build a building. I mean, it takes a huge effort, and it does really require sort of change across the industry. And that can be hard sometimes, there's lots of times where, someone will hold up the red flag and say, no, to the future, not today, we'll save that for tomorrow. And it's like, well, you can't keep kicking the can down the road,
I think the fact that the industry is also something like a 40% contributor to sort of carbon emissions.
Massive.
It's huge, isn't it? And I think that then leads on to the work you see that is, a certain strand that the practice is doing is this sort of adaptive reuse, which seems incredibly important, actually looking at the existing building stock we've got and not putting into landfill and actually the embodied carbon that's there. I want to talk a little bit about Greenland, which is very close here to the office. I think, Phillip, you're leading on it, and it was a result of a competition, an existing 26-storey commercial building that you've then added another 40 stories onto, creating a new residential building in the heart of what is of a business district. And so what were the key architectural moves that, I guess, brought a place to live in, really,
The brief for the competition was retaining the existing building and adding basically 40-ish stories on top of it. That came with a structural solution of how you reinforced or space framed around the old structure and went over. In that brief, that space frame actually created lots of barriers in front of the lower of apartments. So we worked in the competition with Arup to see how we could simplify that. And because Arup said this was, at the time, thought it was the first time in the world that such a large addition had been put on top of a building. That was sort of a given in the competition, and then we sort of enhanced what the result would be. For us with the competition, though, one of the big things that we saw was it's going to be the tallest residential building in Sydney and one of the tallest buildings. And we wanted it to be livable in a Sydney sort of way. After about 20 stories or so, a balcony in an apartment might only be used half the time. They have to rely on air conditioning because you can't open the windows because it's too windy and it gusts through. So we call our competition entry air. We created this sort of what we called at the time the Sydney balcony. And that was really about creating an area that had to cleverly not count as internal space so that the developer wouldn't be penalised for trying this innovation. By doing that, you not only got an outdoor space that we were hoping you could increase usage up to about 80 or 90%, but it also meant you could have your windows and doors open and get air moving softly through rather than sort of ripping your doors off their hinges. And I think that was probably the single thing that won the competition for us. But interestingly, that it informed the architecture of the whole building, the serrated nature of it, and basically the aesthetics of the whole thing.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the material palette of it? Because it's quite an interesting part of Sydney with the sort of how you picked up the language of that precinct and the area and the building, the historic building of what mid-interwar Art Deco building, one of those last buildings that's created that's now being converted into a hotel, but how you've sort of picked up on the immediate character of the building.
It was interesting because the City of Sydney had their policy is for sandstone to be used because it's the sandstone city. And you could see the other competitors picked up on that. We actually looked at that actual corner, and there's two red brick buildings. The one's a pub, heritage pub, and another red brick building on the other corner, which is more of a commercial building. And to us, this wasn't a sandstone part of the city. And then it has the tiled heritage building, which is part of the development, the old water board headquarters, which is sort of a variety of different colours. So our first proposal was to use more of a red colour to the base of the building so that it actually became an identifiable part of the city. And so that's informed the colour of the base. And again, now it's just been revealed in the last few weeks, and I think you can see that connection if you go there. And obviously the council picked up on it straight away and allowed us to deviate from that. And then the next part is the podium, which is that creative hub. That sort of sets a datum that relates to the old heritage building. The building's set back, so you see a sort of a corner of the Art Deco building that will always be viewed now along Pitt Street rather than pushing it right out to the street. And then the articulation of the existing building. So you sort of have you've got your street, then podium, and then you've got the existing building. And then there's this massive truss that's again picking up on the red. And that was deliberate, so that if you were somewhere in the city, you went, oh, that's that red, that's where that building is. So you're sort of giving a bigger message out. And then it changes its form to the Sydney balconies where it's above 20-ish stories, so where the balconies needed to change to something that was more usable. And then it's basically a 40-storey concrete frame building sitting on top of an old steel frame building. And that big truss.
It's no small feat of structural engineering.
It is.
I guess beautiful lead on to Quay Quarter as well, which is interesting because it's got both that. It's a really important site down by the city, eastern side of the city, close to Circular Quay, the Opera House, the Botanic Gardens, but also some of the really, Chifley Tower and those big office buildings there.
The project really kind of scales between the residential, which is in the smaller component, like in the Loftus Lane precinct, which is really that small laneway, low-key, customs house kind of level of building, and that becomes sort of the livable component with small retailers and things, and then you get the very large, significant tower, which is going to become a new part of the city skyline, which will be quite pronounced in that view.
Hello, I'm Michael Wheatley, and today I'm here on site to give you an update on AMP Capital's landmark development, Quay Quarter Sydney. The Quay Quarter Sydney redevelopment is transforming 2 city blocks into a new, vibrant neighbourhood for the city. On the site of 50 Bridge Street, we're redeveloping Quay Quarter Tower. It has 50 floors and about 90,000 square metres of office, along with retail and public open spaces. The tower consists of 5 villages stacked upon each other with atriums that create a highly connected workplace, maximise the views to Sydney Harbour and bring natural daylight into the workplace. Over the road in Quay Quarter Lanes, we're developing a new laneway precinct with urban retail, fantastic restaurants, cafes, bars. We also have 2 heritage refurbishments and we're delivering 104 luxury apartments. The development of the works are progressing really well. Despite the disruption of COVID-19 over the last 12 months, the project remains on track. Quay Quarter Lanes is due for completion in April, and we will be opening Hinchcliffe House with its fabulous bar and restaurant. We'll then be bringing the lanes to life through public art and the launch of about 20 retailers later this year. For Quay Quarter Tower, the structure has nearly topped out and the facade is nearing completion. I'm really pleased to say that our office leasing is over 85% complete. As the tenants experience the building coming to life, they're really excited to see the opportunity for their workplace and for their business. We're also in the process of finalising an operator agreement for our flexible space, and our retail leasing has commenced. This overall amenity that we're creating for our tenants and our customers has been a key part of our leasing success to date. As the tower comes to life, we're really excited to be ready for opening in 2022. I hope you've enjoyed this short update on Quay Quarter Sydney, and we look forward to sharing more with you soon.
And so you're now also working alongside 3XN, who won the international competition which was, as you say, retaining something like 60% of the structure of the
60%
AMP.
of the existing core was retained, and basically a new part of the floor plate was grafted onto the old structure. So a bit like Greenland, incredibly complex in the engineering, probably one of the most complex builds in Sydney at the moment.
Say what you like about the Sirius building, it's certainly a head-turner and it's got million-dollar views to boot.
There is something about this building that has a magical quality.
Magical or not, the location of Sirius is virtually unrivalled and the government's planning to sell it to developers.
Save our Sirius! Save our Sirius!
Among the protesters today was Jack Mundy. The unionist led the Green Ban movement in the 1970s to save the rocks from redevelopment. Now, unions are again imposing a ban on any demolition at the site.
And just let us resolve to keep the fight going. Thank you.
Sirius was built in 1979 to accommodate public housing tenants who'd been displaced by development. 89-year-old Myra Dimitriou is one of the few remaining residents. She's taking eviction in her stride.
Don't worry about it. This is another blimp in my life because I haven't had an easy life.
It will destroy the social mix, the very soul of our city, and we will fight that all the way.
It's been described as a beautiful example of brutalist architecture. Love it or loathe it, the government says the sale of this building will provide money for new social housing that'll accommodate hundreds of families.
Every cent that comes from Sirius, and indeed all sales at Millers Point, are going into the new housing. It's been kept in a special account.
Today, the minister inspected one of 28 refurbished units at Millers Point.
ministerial check-off.
The government says they're being offered to those who want to remain in the area, but opponents say social housing tenants are gradually being driven out.
Well, we're here today to tell you, Mike Baird, that they do deserve to live in nice places, and we'll fight you to the death for that right.
The Sirius site could be worth over $100 million.
Moving down to another really important site, and one that's, I guess, been in not just part of local discussion, but actually international attention, is the Sirius project. The amount of conversation around it, I think, has been really interesting. Part of this Save Sirius campaign, it's a very public project, campaigning, one, a reaction against the proposed demolition, but also the rehousing of the social housing tenants there. And many of had lived there since it was designed by Titchkosky in 1979. So I wanted to talk to you, I guess, how what you see your role as architects in this project of upholding both the architectural heritage and the social legacy of that project is, and how you take that on as architects now, dealing with this kind of really important site and the responsibility of it.
I think us taking the project on was another subject of robust conversations.
It was, absolutely.
And they were very valuable, robust conversations. And when we were first approached, it was still sort of fairly fresh in relation to the removal of the social housing. That was a decision that had been taken, and we weren't going to be able to reverse that in any way. And the current issue at that time was that the government had refused to heritage list it, and the building wasn't safe. And when the government put it up for sale, there was sort of two sets of codes, one if you kept the building, one if you demolished it. And for residential or hotel use, most of the bidders were going to demolish it, that's what we understand. So BVN's stance when we were approached by the developer was, we really can only work with you if you're going to retain the building, which they agreed to, and they understood the issues. But we went a step further and said, but we have to retain with what we said was integrity. There had been a lot of images in the public, in the press over the years about this building renovated and things, in which case it was painted white and added curved balconies, or it had all a series of things. We said, we want to design something where you see the building that was there, and then you clearly articulated what's been added to it.
And it is interesting though, isn't it? Because Sirius is one of those buildings it's just been in Sydney's skyline for such a long time. And I remember, growing up on the North Shore, you'd be putting your 20 cents in at the Harbour Bridge, going across to the city, and it would just always be there, that building. And it was always quite intriguing because it had sort of purplish window frames and the brutalist concrete kind of modularity. And it would just, it's one of those decisions as architects that we have to start to have a position on, what is our position about that, because same with heritage buildings that are, older again, we may not be always able to influence change, but, if we can, we should have a position on it, and we should try and, work with the position we have and see if we can get a good outcome for the city and help the developer understand that actually, and we genuinely believe that, that's the key value in this building, is retaining its identity, is where it's actually going to deliver them value if they can, if they can sit with that comfortably and actually kind of bring it back to life, because it's just such an identifiable piece of Sydney's fabric.
Because Phillip, you've worked on a couple of projects where you've worked with existing buildings, and also ones that I guess, like you say, Ninotschka, it was a really revered building, or everyone had an opinion on it too, and it is really architecturally distinct. So I'm wondering what it's like working, do you learn from working with, these quite iconic buildings, like also, I think there was, I think you worked on Di Jones' project, the International Grammar School, working with existing buildings that have an architectural quality. What you learn about architecture and working with somebody else's work so intimately. I wonder, have there been things that have sparked, you thought, I hadn't looked at architecture like that? Has there been a process of learning you've gone through?
There was in a way when we first started looking at the building, about the reasons behind the split level designs, and if you look at even the development of its design in old sketches and things, you sort of go, and it's the political history of why it was there. So I learnt a lot about Sydney in relative terms about doing it. And then brutalist, but also modular architecture, because it is so yes, and Peter Titmus is the other principal that's working on with me, particularly went into the history and things, so we could bring that to help inform our design.
Particularly in Australia, because we're a relatively new country, we've really operated very much, certainly in the developer world, on a knockdown is best mentality. You know, it's actually, you immediately say we should be retaining something, and the next sort of thing is, well, that's going to be more expensive. It's like, well, but maybe it's the right thing to do. And unlike, say, in a European setting, we do have we have had, at least in the past, I think very much that shiny and new is best, and also that it's cheaper and more cost effective, and we can solve the problem. But I think these kinds of projects become so important to demonstrate the kind of careful editing of what we already have, and then building on it as well, and reinventing it and allowing it to kind of adapt and have a new life. And if we're genuine about, you know, sustainability and reducing the impact to the planet, we have to kind of be able to reinvent and adapt our existing buildings, which really are 98% of the building stock on the planet. You know, only 2% is new, and yet we spend a lot of time talking about 2%, but we just can't take our eyes off, you know, the existing building component.
There's a lot to be learned, isn't there, too, about the kind of much more circular thinking that you take from the land, you build back to it, and that connection to it, which goes to your work too, about the sort of connection of what we build, more circular economy, that these, how buildings are produced, I guess, and then how they're operated, that they're not always drawing upon resources. So maybe
Absolutely.
Interesting to think then, in contrast to those sites when you're working with buildings, actually going up to somewhere like Central, which the Atlassian building, new headquarters for one of these new tech giants, it's got a lot of, that whole site has a lot of layered history, but yet in some ways it's spatially a bit of a now tabula rasa. The state government is wanting to make this sort of tech central to rival Silicon Valley, you know, which has to attract a lot of people. But I guess, how did you think about that building in such a different thing? It is you know, it will then form a cluster of things, but it's almost the start of something. How did you think about designing that building? It's
well, that one is a collaboration as well, actually, with Shop in New York and BVN, and it is a really interesting site because it's got Aboriginal history, it's got the kind of early colonial history, then it's got the transport history, and now it's sort of got this new layer over the top of it. You know, over time, like most cities, kind of certain things have been perhaps, they haven't evolved in positive ways. So part of it is actually unpicking those things and sort of trying to remake them to some extent. But that building, you know, the Atlassian headquarters will be kind of the first one, and it'll be sort of the catalyst for the rest of the precinct. I mean, I guess the way that sort of unfolded was Atlassian had very sort of clear goals that they wanted to embed in the project, particularly around environmental goals, so 50% less embodied carbon than a traditionally built building on the same site, 100% renewable energy, and then a little bit similar to the conversation we were having about Key Quarter, the kind of idea about how do you take, you know, an organisation and that started as a very intimate thing with a couple of guys and, you know, grew into this incredibly sort of successful story, but how do you take that sort of cultural intimacy and put it into something much bigger? There's sort of multiple layers to that. Then it sits on a very complex transport corridor, so it's the single biggest transport hub in Australia, so everything comes into Central. which makes it super complicated as just a build. And then we're actually building the building, in fact, over the top of an existing timber heritage shed, which used to be where all the mail would come into the city and then go back out. And so we're in fact dismantling the shed and remaking the shed around the new building. You know, we're literally looking at bolts and screws and, you know, looking at peeling back the layers of paint that are all over the timber. And then the final layer is sort of the designing with country layer, and how we actually then bring back the kind of forgotten landscape that used to exist on the site. The roof of the shed will now become like a green roof that then will have sort of timber kind of seating on it that becomes a bit like the sort of rocky outcrops that used to exist around the site, and it will start to regenerate landscape back into what's a pretty harsh environment at the moment.
So you're
very late.
It's very late. And a little bit more back. It's a timber framed building.
So yeah, it's set to be the world's tallest hybrid timber tower. So hybrid because we don't currently have the technology and may never have the technology to do a 40-storey building completely out of timber. You know, it means that the timber sections become so big that it's not tenable really. So it's actually got a concrete core. Every 4 levels is a mega floor, which is concrete and steel. And then inside each of those big spaces, then there's 4 timber levels that get fitted into that. They become a habitat, and then each of those habitats sort of gear up around a park, which brings landscape up into the tower, and then natural ventilation through that part of the building.
What do you think as architects you bring, you know, exploring the city, the way of reading the city, skills that, like, what do you feel that you bring to the table when you're sitting also around a table of developers? You know, what is it that architects have, those things that isn't, you know, it's building things? Is it a way of, you talk about problem solving, but I'm thinking about sort of spatial problem solving, what you feel that you've got, you know, what is it about being an architect that has value to the world?
Well, one, I think you just mentioned working with developers. I think as an architect, we've got obviously a responsibility to the overall city, and it's where you value that, and then the fine balance of the client. And this is not just in the city, this is any building, like responsibilities to the planet, to the context, things. But then you're being paid by this person, and you sort of have to, I think that person has to feel that you're got empathy for what they're doing, and you do care about what they need, and then you've almost got to sort of educate them to show, well, these are the really important things. We know you want to get 50,000 square metres of office space. How do you get that in the best way that does all these things too? So I always find it like it's a balancing act.
What's on those things? What are those really important things here often?
Well, obviously there's not just like the future and the sustainable aspects of making the buildings better than they are at the moment. The context, so that it doesn't become a hero building, that it's more about, if it's in the city, it's knitted into the city, that it responds to that part of the city. So that I spoke about Greenland, and that we went against the sandstone of the sandstone city, and people understood that. The developer understood that. So it's all about just saying that these are the bits that we add. And again, with Greenland in particular, I mentioned that you see the building in different parts of the city, from the airport down to when you're standing on the street. So understanding that, and then being able to sort of educate the client to say, well, this is good for the city, but it's also good for you in these ways.
I mean, I absolutely agree. I think we have such a long shadow in what we do, don't we? You know, we don't just sort of do something and then it doesn't matter. It matters for a really long time, and you know, we really try and respect that when we're doing projects, and not just sort of brush that away and sort of go, we can just do what we think is going to look great, for example. It's really not the main game for us. So I think for us, actually, the biggest thing that we bring is curiosity, because we have a sort of a willingness to be open to what might be possible, and then the other part is actually being able to synthesize that into something that kind of can bring all these really complex threads together and still make sense. And that's, I mean, I think that's really, you know, a lot of what we actually do, but also still respect the fact that we need to bring, society, infrastructure and ecology together into balance in doing that. Everything that we do affects the planet, it affects people's lives, it kind of sends messages, good and bad if we get it wrong. I don't know, I think there's quite a big responsibility being an architect actually because of that long shadow, and we just need to kind of keep being curious about the possibilities and extending ourselves beyond what we think might just be our remit, much to the annoyance of some of our clients sometimes, where we're like, your business models just needs a bit of an overhaul because that's really not going to support this whole thing. So, but that's actually sort of what we can kind of see the whole system a little bit more, and then see that actually these days it's not just about building something, it's almost, there are a whole lot of levers that need to be kind of adjusted and nuanced to get everything working and being a really good outcome. We're also in our research looking at services systems that kind of service these buildings that we exist in, and so the current project that we're doing is a fully 3D printed air diffusion system, which is all made out of recycled soft plastics, fully robotically 3D printed, it's all modular, so in terms of adapting a space, it's just a click and play modular thing. And then if certain elements no longer need to be reused, they can just be crushed and returned back to new pellets, which can be reprinted again. So closing that sort of loop on the circular economy is important as well, and it's not always just about the big structural things that we do, but there's also all the enablers like services and things which become a little bit the hidden layer. What's lovely about it is you're also bringing design and beauty into these things that no one would ever think. Services can be beautiful, and they are. Exactly. How the form moves, and that it in themselves, as they move around the space, generates a sort of architectural interest and stimulation. And I think that that's adding this kind of design and a conversation about aesthetics alongside the circular economy, that it can be practical and it can work, is a really important thing. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's really fundamental, because if we can make it aesthetically appealing and contributing as well, then we don't need the ceiling layer, and then we don't need to expend that embodied carbon, and it is less cost and less time and more easily adaptable. So it all sort of ties in together and all supports each other, doesn't it?
You have brought the aesthetic, like they're very appealing, but to my mind, you didn't just say, oh, I want to do it like this, or the group. You actually, it's making them more efficient.
Yeah,
even
absolutely.
in there. So you spoke about recycling, but it's also making them more efficient, which you've then used those shapes out of that to inform the aesthetic. So it wasn't just sort of put on top, it was actually developed with it.
Yeah, so it's all been done through fluid dynamics and computational modelling so that we've absolutely optimised the form. So it sounds super logical, but it is in fact now aerodynamic. But, you know, and through that it gave us the ability to morph the aesthetics of, you know, what was possible. But if we didn't build it with 3D printing, it wouldn't be possible because we just couldn't make it commercially viable at scale. So that's where sort of technologies give us the ability to do these things differently and come at a problem, which is really, you know, air conditioning ducting hasn't really changed much, not in its most sort of prolific form for like 95 years.
And there's something also about it becoming legible. This stuff that, you know, the room just becomes cool and we don't know how. It was all behind something. Actually, to sort of start to understand a greater connection to the planet and how it works and our cycle, actually seeing how much ductwork it takes to move this around.
It's such a good point. And you know, I mean, it is a really good point, and that you can value that. And yeah, as you say, the more awareness that you bring to it, then, you know, people understand the problem and, you know, the kind of consciousness grows. But there's even so many logistical benefits, like the amount of trucks that have to come into a construction site to deliver thousands of, you know, 1,200 high steel ducts is just massive. You could actually build these on site if you wanted to. You could just set up a little robotic factory on site and just build them on site, or you could, they're optimized, they're like half the size of existing ducts because of the optimization process. And so you can use less trucks to deliver, less things on the road, you know, less congestion in the city. Like there's just so many knock-ons when you think about these things. So it's been an interesting problem to solve, a challenge.
I'm interested in some of these research projects and also, I guess, what the architect brings to looking at the world. And thinking about Reply, which was a project which started in New York right at the time of the Black Lives Matter, of the protests that were taking place, COVID. And your partners over there sort of suddenly seeing opportunity in the city. And do you want to talk a little bit about that, how the project came about, and, you know, what it is to do these sort of self-initiated projects where you're also the client and driving those agendas that you're talking about?
Well, I suppose when we first in Sydney heard about Reply, it was our partner principal in Bill in New York, just seeing all this plywood being shoved over the front of all the shops, and having been in lockdown for something like 6 months or something at the time, and he knowing that the council or the council were going to be giving away part of the road to let the shops inhabit the footpath and restaurants, and he just basically sort of well, they're going to bring all this new stuff in temporarily, why can't we use that plywood? And so this idea, it was really just came from, why not use the plywood that's here, and this story of it coming off the windows and becoming part of the furniture. So that's really what initiated it for us, as far as I...
Yeah, and absolutely it was. It was just, you know, everything hoarded, thinking, what a waste, this is all just going to go to landfill, what are we going to do with it? Seeing linking an opportunity of, you know, because the restaurants and the cafes couldn't have any internal dining at all in COVID, so they had to bring it all out to the street, and just sort of linking those two opportunities together. So our team pretty much just went and created a new little organisation called reply.org, hired trucks, created a little kind of way of constructing them and brought in some partners, and then went around the city and worked with the landlords collecting the plywood and things, and then repurposed it into outdoor dining furniture basically, which was pretty cost effective and very quick to turn around for cafe owners and restaurateurs and things. From that, it still had, some of the pieces still had the memory of whatever was put on the panels and things, which was really nice. And then from that, it's actually even grown a little further, where businesses, like we have a relationship already with Neuhaus, which is one of the big co-working providers in New York, and they saw an opportunity to actually create, you know, a purpose-built plywood element that we designed for them in their parking bay that was really quite long. It's called the Longhouse, to bring working out to the street and use that opportunity. And so now we've got more of those opportunities, as well as, you know, all the little moments and bits of furniture that we're doing all over the place. So there's been an installation in the Rockefeller Centre, and yeah, it's been quite extraordinary because people really connected, I think, with the idea of, you know, the repurposing of the moment and also the kind of the social connection and helping the city and trying to find solutions. And it's been a pretty fantastic little initiative, actually.
It seems like one of those things that was initially thinking it was going to be temporary, but that might become more permanent in parts of the city.
Yeah.
I'm Dr. Jean Sherman, founder and director of SCCI, the Sherman Centre for Culture and Ideas. You've been watching a SCCI Cinéphile Hub episode. This episode has been proudly supported by the SCCI Cinéphile Circle of private patrons. We are grateful for their generous assistance alongside a number of commercial, educational, cultural and government organisations, including the City of Sydney. More episodes are available for you to enjoy at sky.org.au. Thank you for joining us.